Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining the Second Mile Fellowship here today. We are in Genesis chapters 35 and 36. I have chapter 35 divided into two sections, and the first 15 verses of chapter 35 is titled Jacob Goes to Bethel. Now, looking here first at the map, if you remember, we had looked at Padan Aram and up in Haran. That's where Jacob had been with Laban, and he journeys down here, and he had went to Penuel. That's Penuel, I think is actually how you say that. That's where he met Esau at. Went on, journeyed over to Succoth and then to Shechem. And Bethel is down here. Now, if you read the description, it's about 12 miles north of Jerusalem. Hebron's down here. Now, what makes this place important is Jacob has history here. This is where, in chapter 28, as Jacob is fleeing, this is where he saw the ladder to heaven. And what we find is that God is calling them back to Bethel. It's a place of remembrance. Go back and look in chapter 28, you'd see God is wanting him to remember their relationship. He's wanting him to remember his promises unto him and Jacob's commitment. You remember, Jacob finalized that whole episode by saying, if you will be with me whithersoever I go and keep me in the way that I go, I will. You will be my God, and I will surely give a tenth unto thee, right? Well, now it is, man, he's back, or he's going back, he's almost back. And look at the change. He went out a pauper, had nowhere to lay his head, had a stone for a pillow, and he's coming back with 12 children and more oxes and asses and things than he can imagine. So God surely had been with him. So God's calling him back to that place. Now, if you look at verse number 2 and 3, it's interesting. It says, Then Jacob said unto his household and to all that were with him, Put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments. And let us arise and go to Bethel, and I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went. He remembered that God had been with him. And notice the order, too. He's telling them, number one, put away the strange gods and change your garments. Get those filthy garments off and put clean garments on, because we're going unto the Lord. And if you're going to go and get back to God, as what God is calling Jacob here to do, then that's the order in which it's going to have to be. You're going to have to put your strange gods away if you're ever going to get back unto God. There's a lot of Christians that they have a bunch of strange gods in their life, and they need to put those away so that they can get back to God. All right? Verses 16 through the remainder of the chapter. And so Jacob, of course, he goes down there to Bethel. And in chapter 16, I have that titled Life, Death, and Sin Therein, because we see one birth, two deaths, and a great sin committed all in these handful of verses here. The first we see is the birth of Benjamin. And they journeyed from Bethel and went a little way and came to Ephrath. Rachel travailed, and she was in hard labor. And she had the child, which was Benjamin, and then she died. And it says there that, in verse number 18, it came to pass, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what those words mean, Ben-Oni means son of my sorrow, and Benjamin means son of my right hand. Now, this tells us a little more about Rachel, I think. And if you go back through Rachel's interactions, whether it was her interactions with Jacob, you remember when Leah started having children, she went to Jacob and she said, give me children lest I die. And he said, what, am I in the stead of God? And they had this whole kerfuffle. Then she wanted mandrakes so that she could get pregnant. She was willing to give up her husband in order to do so. And then when God did bless her, after all these others, two handmaids and the other wife having all these children, and God blessed her with this child several years later in Joseph, what did she say? God's going to give me another. It wasn't about what God had done. It's about what God is going to do for her, because that's what her mindset was on her. And here it is, in her final moments, she gets what she asked for, a second son. But then she says, he's the son of my sorrow. My sorrow. So all the time as you go down through, it was never enough. She lived such an unsatisfied life. It's probably because of the gods in which she served. Remember, she's the one that stole the gods of her daddy Laban. And there were strange gods with them as they journeyed unto Bethel, and it was probably hers. All right, moving on. Let's see. Verse number 22, great sin that stayed with Reuben the remainder of his days. He slept with Bilhah, which was Rachel's wife, and that's the only mention of it until we get to chapter 49. And so there's that there. And then lastly here, it lists through verses 23 through 26 the 12 sons through the 4 women that God had given Jacob, and in Isaac's death there in 29. And we see Esau and Jacob buried him. Now that brings us to chapter 36. Chapter 36 is essentially the generations of Esau. We see it there in verse number 1. And we see multiple times in this passage of Scripture words such as what is found there in verse number 1, Esau, who is Edom. Verse number 8, thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom. If you go down through there, again, verse number 19, these are the sons of Esau, who is Edom. Verse number 43, Esau, the father of the Edomites. It's like Moses is wanting to make sure that everybody knew who Esau was and the relationship that the Edomites had under the children of Israel. Now, the Edomites or Esau is mentioned over 200 times in Scripture. Jacob or the children of Israel is mentioned over 2,000 times. So Esau and the Edomites are mentioned a lot throughout Scripture, but what's more important than the quantity of how many times they're mentioned is the quality thereof, or the impact. And that is, as you study the Edomites, which came after Esau, they were wicked. They were enemies to the children of Israel. The impact of the Edomites was wicked. Now, I made mention, I don't think it was yesterday, but the day before, about Esau, and I think how Esau was a good man, but he wasn't a godly man. He had enough godly influence around him that he lived essentially a moral life. But you see, God is the basis for morality, and once God is eroded away, then morality falls. And I think if you were to study the Edomites, that's what happened. See, because his sons didn't have necessarily Isaac and Jacob as great influences in their life, and certainly not their sons. So the religious aspect, or the godly aspect, I should say, not necessarily religion, but godly aspect of their lives was eroded away. Esau had it, but they didn't. So Esau may have lived good and moral in a sense, but his children and his children's children certainly did not have really a chance. What we have in America is we have the mindset that we can be good without God, and it's just not possible. Once God is taken away, there is no foundation for morality, and it will soon dissipate. We see it happening in our country today. So as we consider the Edomites, they had a great physical heritage upon the earth, but spiritual impact was wicked. And you know, I am excited that I am going to be a grandpa. That excites me. But I want my lineage to be that of godliness. And if I were in Esau's position, I certainly would not be proud of the heritage in which I left. But it all starts with carnality, and it ends up in moral depravity. And that's what we have for today. That's Genesis chapters 35 and 36. I hope this has been a help and a blessing to you, and Lord willing, we'll see you tomorrow.